choice. That's what we believe. We believe we're the chosen people. We don't believe Jews are the chosen people. We don't believe Jews are the ones going to the promised land. We don't think Jews are a part of God. No, Jews are nothing but another part of that same race of devils that come out of Europe. Black people are standing up. Black people are rising up, and they're starting fight.
We were slaves in Egypt. We belong to the Father, ain't no pledge of allegiance. We both to celebrate that killing that he didn't need you. We both to keep the holy days, don't be like the heathen. He said that for a reason.
That has been part of human culture and humanity's experience, and may even in a way led to culture, that has been with us for tens of thousands of years. You know, the current archaeological evidence regarding hemp, there's been hemp fiber cloth found from that are used in breaking the fibers off of hemp that were still used up until a few centuries ago, that are dated around 28,000 years ago. This puts cannabis into the realm of what's known as the Great Leap Forward, when humanity started coming up with new novel concepts, things like the wheel and fire. And Dr. Jeffrey Guy and his partner Rick Hartland, they have a whole theory going based on the endocannabinoid system and how it works within the brain, that humanity may have some sort of co-evolutionary relationship with this plant. And you know, you got to think, as we traveled from place to place, we took that plant with us, and it was growing in our human waste. You know what I mean? Because nothing was put to waste in the old world. Even the night soil, which was human fertilizer and stuff like that, was put back into the earth, and in a way, it was ingesting us. We were ingesting that plant. And people like Carl Sagan, for instance, have suggested that cannabis was humanity's first agricultural crop, and agriculture led to those settlements that led to human culture. You know what I mean? So we have, you know, an unidentifiable right to this plant and a long, long history, and we're rediscovering that history, and people like yourself are bringing it back. Archaeologically, it's difficult to study cannabis because plant fibers and things like that break down in a different way. So a lot of the ancient world stuff has been the result of carbonized cannabis, burnt cannabis. And the oldest evidence we have of burnt cannabis comes actually from the Ukraine region, amongst a Proto-Indo-European group, the Sardini stock. And this is the type of bowls they would have burnt it on. And this is, you know, so 5,500 years ago, 1,000 years before the Bible was written, people were burning cannabis for spiritual purposes, and they found a cave where this was taking place. And these were the predecessors of a group you've probably all heard of, the Scythians. And they were also the domesticators of the horse, and it's believed that even the domestication of the horse might have been the result of the development of hemp fibers for rope, you know. So this is this, and it's believed that around about 2000 BC or so, that these braziers gave way. They were really popular. We find these types of braziers all over the place. It was obviously a pretty common practice throughout ancient Europe. It gave way to corded ware vessel, and that is, so this is corded ware. And Dr. Andrew Charette, well-known British archaeologist, he believed that these containers were used for drinking cannabis, and he based this on that they were actually printed with hemp cord, and they had hemp cord impressions. And he based this on these type of vessels here, which contain poppies, were made to look like poppies. And this view has been picking up by a lot of ancient Indo-European researchers as the Encyclopedia of Indo-European Culture states, and this is like a textbook for the study of this. As cannabis can also be infused, i.e. served as a component in a drink, it has also been suggested that the spread of cord hemp decorated pottery from the steppe westward may also have been a part of the same complex. And this is a really widespread culture. This is how far this corded ware culture. So the major researchers of this period of time are concurring that they believe that this was all being cannabis burning and also cannabis drinking cultures throughout that whole area there. So this is a big portion of our ancestors. The authors of the Encyclopedia of Indo-European Culture have noted there are at least 3 chronological horizons to which the spread of hemp might be ascribed. The early distribution of hemp across Europe during the Neolithic period, that is 5000 BC or earlier, a later spread of hemp for presumably narcotic purposes around 3000 BC, and still a later, at least, re-emergence of hemp in the context of textiles for the first millennium BC. So these were big waves of cannabis culture that spread throughout the whole of Europe, you know what I mean? And, they found evidence of cannabis at Celtic sites, at Druidic sites, and burials there. So it was already ritually being used throughout all of Europe. The descendants of the Sarah stock, who I mentioned earlier in relation to the Braziers, are commonly known as the Siths. And they're largely responsible for the spread of the use of cannabis throughout the ancient world. And they had a really interesting culture. So this is like Scythian braziers, and these are like what they would do is they would heat these rocks up, and then they would take them inside these enclosed structures like this, and burn it, and then they would inhale the fumes. And this is one of the braziers. These are the rocks they would heat up. This is a smaller version than the one in the other picture, but they have different sizes of these things, different size tents as well. And they would heat the rocks up, put the rocks in there, and this is remnants from what was left over. And this is an example of one of the Scythian tents that they would use. This one's actually not that big. Like Herodotus had written about them, and he described them in a group inside a tent. But this one was actually like more of a personal type of thing, and it was only about 3 or 4 feet tall. What you would do is you would heat up the cannabis and put it in, and then you would just stick your head in the tent and inhale the fumes. So it's like kind of like the vaporizer 2,500 years ago. You heat the rocks at volcano 500 BC, and so.
We're doing that next year.
So this is the tattoos off a Scythian warrior where that same brazier came from. They have mummified remains of these Siths, so we know a lot about them. And this guy was like 6'4". He was like 65 when he died on the battlefield. So these were very, very healthy people, you know what I mean? Ages like that were very uncommon, and this guy was like still running out with the young fellas out to battle on the battleground. And they were an interesting culture in the sense that women fought alongside the men. Their priesthood was often at times transgender individuals, and they were very, very fierce warriors, but also known for their great nobility. And more recently, there's been this discovery of Scythian gold bowls and cups mistakenly portrayed as bongs in the popular media in the last year. But they were actually cups and bowls used for drinking a cannabis and opium preparation. And the archaeologist involved with the discovery and analysis in this regard suggests that they were cups and bowls for drinking heoma. And heoma is the predecessor of soma, the Vedic beverage that's well known as a sacrament and was what was used in Persia. And the Scythians themselves were known as the heoma barter, the heoma gatherers. And so because of the Scythian spread of cannabis throughout the ancient world, because of this high mobility on horses, this use and a lot of mythology and spiritual use of cannabis also spread with them. And we have traces of this in a variety of Indo-European languages that developed out of the same culture that the Scyths involved out before the spread of cannabis. And the original name of cannabis is kana in Indo-European, and the AN of that carried through in a number of other words, like the French chambre, or the English cannabis, or the Sanskrit's bang, or the Persian banga, or the German hanf, and other related dialects. They all have that AN in there because of their common root, and there's similarities in a lot of other words as well. And and then in China, we have the situation where Emperor Shennong, legendary mythical emperor who could apparently examine the effects of plants because he had an invisible stomach wall where he could look right into his stomach, is what the myths say. But he prescribed cannabis for a number of things, and cannabis ended up in the Pensao, which some people would date at 2,700 years, as early as 2,700 BC, but that may be just a mythological date, but it's at least a few hundred BC. And cannabis was also very big with the Taoist religion in China, where it was used for kind of like astral traveling to the land of the immortals, and burnt in braziers that they would meditate over. And there's a quatrain from about, I think, around 350 BC from China. First a yin, then a yang. No one knows what I do. Jade buds of holy hemp for the one that lives apart. And that's kind of like cannabis. You can have your ups and downs.
Could you repeat that?
First a yin, then a yang. No one knows what I do. Jade buds of holy hemp for the one that lives apart. And so it's kind of like we have our ups and downs in life, but cannabis kind of keeps you in that centered kind of path, The Chinese had it also. There's corded ware in China, so it's from around the same period that it's in Europe. And some people have said that this is also a connection. And we definitely know that the Chinese had an agent relationship. China in the ancient world was known as the land of mulberry and hemp. The first anesthesia with cannabis hemp wine preparation comes from China. Hemp paper originated in China, and they used to be able to grow hemp seed food sources as big as peas. Hemp seeds as big as peas. A really interesting study thing that's happened in the last about 10 or 15 years is the discovery of these Caucasian mummies right in central China. This was probably a Scythian offshoot. They spoke the same language as the Scythian, the same Indo-European type of languages. And they were there in China from about 2000 BC to about 300 or 400 BC when the Han Chinese, the indigenous Chinese, chased them out. But they existed there, cohabitated for a long time, and they discovered a couple of tombs from shamans that contained cannabis, and one of them 2 pounds of female cannabis. And it was all contained in the basket there, and this was a bowl that he would use to crush the cannabis. And this is a close-up of the bag and the bowl that were used for cannabis preparation. And this is actual, the leaf of the cannabis was still green. The cannabis, you can see the resin glands on it there. So it's perfectly preserved because of the cold climate. They tried to sprout the seeds, but unfortunately they wouldn't sprout. This is the mummified remains of the mummy. It's interesting, the cowrie shells on his hat, they actually came from India. And so this is how widespread their trade routes were. And this guy's from 2,700 years ago, so they already had pretty well-established trade routes. And this find has changed the way we think about things like the origins of the Silk Road. It used to be about 200 or 300 BC. Now they've had to put it back a couple thousand years earlier. And they've tested DNA from these mummies, and they're like a mixed breed of person, kind of like you might expect to find in the city of New York. They've just got like DNA from Western Europe, Eastern Europe, China, India, and so it's like a real mishmash of cultures. These Scythians were involved in trade between, the Scythians mentioned before were involved in trade between the Chinese region up there where we found the mummy and this area here, Bimak, which is just in Afghanistan there. And they found a 4,000-year-old, what they call Soma Temple in China. And this is a reconstruction of the site. That's about as big as a football field. And half the temple itself was dedicated to the preparation of a sacred beverage, the soma or hayoma, would have been known in this region here. And we know this because of Professor Victor Sarianati, the Russian archaeologist that is responsible for the excavation of this site and the analysis of materials found at the site. Here's the site itself, and close-up of the temple. So this was like a major depot 4,000 years ago for the ancient world. People would travel to this site from all over, very advanced building and civilization. And these are areas that were used for crushing up and preparing the soma, which in most cases, you found 3 of these temples was a preparation of cannabis and ephedra. And it's interesting because that these sites in China as well, they found ephedra and cannabis together. And they tested positive also in one site for opium as well. So there's a cannabis, ephedra, and opium in some places. And also there's the impressions of these the site. And these are the tools and stuff that they found, the bowls. And these pipes here actually contained, they were like drinking tubes, and they contained residue of opium, their bone, and had eyes carved on them. This would have been a filtering thing where they would have laid lamb wool or something like that and steeped it through there into that, Those are up there in that corner are more of the impressions from the seed. And this is very similar to the way the cannabis is still prepared today in India for bhang. And here's the Lord Shiva, the oldest continually worshipped god on earth, preparing bhang. He's crushing it with a rock on there and then making the green liquid after sifting it, And this use was also in Islamic world as well. They had, this is from an 18th century painting about fakirs. And see, they've got the sieve there for straining it, much like the one in that archaeological dig. And this guy up here is breaking the cannabis apart, and they're preparing the cannabis. This guy over here is stripping it from the stalks and stuff, and this guy's having a bong hit while the other guys are working too hard. This guy's stripping it from the stalks. So these are Sufis from the 18th century, still preparing cannabis 2,000 years later. 4,000 years later in a very similar way to where it was prepared at that archaeological site. And what is really interesting is in Syria, they were preparing it and drinking it as hayoma still, 4,000 years later. So this firmly identifies the drink. Now, it disappeared, of course, through history. That's why we don't know what it is. Then what happened is the Zoroastrian religion, the Mazdian religion, which was preparing Homa, had a great reformer known as Zoroaster. Zoroaster was kind of a monotheist. He was one of the first monotheist believer in one god, or should be really considered dualistic because he believed in a god and a devil, and had a lot of power as well. Zoroaster was very concerned about the rituals around Hayoma. There was apparently a lot of orgiastic rites around it, and they were up all night, and the animal slaughters and sex rites and whatnot. Probably the federally stimulated people, kept them awake quite late. And he took the religion through a number of reforms, but he didn't completely prohibit cannabis. He kept it, but it was more of a drink of the elites at this time, and he would add it to wine in preparation. They would be knocked out for days, and they would have visions, and many of these visions were recorded as their religious things. And this is where actually the myths about heaven and hell originated, was visionary figures like Ardu Viraf, who were initiated by bong with this drink, mang mixed into wine, which was a powerful cannabis extract. And Ardu Viraf claimed after he woke up from his 2-day knockout that he'd gone to see heaven and then had been down to the depths of hell, and that filtered into Judaism and Christianity. And so that's Zoroaster right there. Zoroaster initiating his first convert, King Vishtaspa, who he introduced to cannabis. And this is the Sinbad Bridge. This is the journey to heaven and hell after they drank the cannabis. This use, what happened then is as the Indo-Europeans spread into India via the advance of the Aryans, that's another name for Indo-Europeans, so did this drink travel with them, and it became known as Soma, which we all talked about earlier in your initiation into Wendy's wonderful class there. So we know that this same drink that they were drinking is what became Soma, so it's pretty clear that Soma was cannabis, and this is the majority view of Indian researchers in India. And people like Chandra Chakraborty have written that Soma was made of the flowering tops and resins of cannabis sativa, which is an aphrodisiac, a stimulant, and a nourishing food. And Joseph Chandra Ray and the Soma plant, the effects of Soma or drink are exactly the same as those of Bang. It's a food, it's exhilarating, exciting, intoxicating, and awakens eager thought, and excites poetic imagination. It cures diseases and was believed to prolong life and give victory. And he cites all the Vedic references which describe the use of Soma. Makes it pretty clear that it was the same thing. And cannabis was also used in the Buddhist religion. And there's legends of the Buddha subsisting on one hemp seed a day. That are, go back to about, I think the oldest text that says that's about 300 AD, but that's sometime after Buddha lived. But in Tantric Buddhism, it's, this is what the one hemp seed a day diet does to you. So he sat under the Bodhi tree and did that. And a large reason it's thought that Soma became lost in India was due to Buddhist reforms, because Buddhism was a very ascetic religion, and this is why alcohol became forbidden and meat eating became forbidden in the Indian religion, was the influence of Buddhism. And so it was very much about sobriety. And but in later Buddhism, cannabis returned, and it was dedicated to Mahakala, the Lord of Time, in Tantric Buddhism. This is a Tibetan painting of Mahakala. Mahakala is the Tibetan Buddhist version of Shiva. And
did you say the Lord of Time?
Lord of Time, yeah. There's a number of texts written regarding cannabis and Mahakala. And cannabis really took although it became prohibited, it started to return, and it came returned in the famous story of the churning of the ocean of milk. And in the story of the churning of the ocean of milk, what happens is Indra, who was the god, who was the chief of the gods in the Vedic pantheon, he was traveling along one day, and a rishi that was a portion of Shiva offered flowers to his elephant, and the elephant knocked the flowers, and Indra was very rude, and because of this, Shiva called down a curse on him, and this caused a curse to take place in both the heaven and the earthly plane. And so they had to gathered, and they went to Brahma, and they said, Brahma, what do we do? And they go, oh, you got to go talk to Vishnu. So they go gather the gods. There's all the different gods there, they get together, Krishna and Brahma, and they go see Vishnu. And they're like, oh, Vishnu, what are we going to do? It's like, and he goes, well, what you need to do is you need to grab potent herbs and throw them into the ocean of milk. And then you grab a mountain, and you use that as a churning stick to churn the potent herbs into the ocean of milk. And it was such a big job, they had to get the demons to join them in the quest. And here they are, they said to the demons, okay, we're going to churn the ocean of milk, and we're going to get the Amrita that will restore the health of the kingdom. And so they go and they get together, and they churn the ocean. Here they are again doing it,
And who's the snake?
The snake, I forget the snake's name, but he had to grab the famous snake as
He was
well.
just a snake god.
Snake god, yeah. And they had to use him to churn it because they weren't going to be able to churn it by themselves. And but they don't want to give it to the demons because then the demons will have the magic of the Amrita as well. So they passed it off to a Garuda, which is a flying bird man. And he takes it off and he spills some drops. And where the drops fell on ground, this is where they hold the Kumbh Mela. And the Kumbh Mela in India takes place at about 4 different sites in India every few years. At one of the sites it takes place. And it's where the drops from the Amrita, which was the Soma, fell onto the earth. And cannabis brought it from these same drops. And every year they have the largest human gathering on earth, the Kumbh Mela. And you can see it from outer space. It's such a large gathering of humans. And it's the longest going on one as well.
Do you know when the next one is?
I'd have to look it up online. Probably, I think about 2 years.
Okay, in 2 years we're doing that.
Yeah. And sadhus come from all over, and cannabis is a big part of the sadhu scene. They partake of cannabis, which they see as born from the body of Shiva. And here's Shiva, himself preparing cannabis. He's grinding the bong here, and here's the green bong. And he's grinding it up with his mortar and pestle, as people have done for thousands of years. And here he is again with his wife Parvati and son Ganesh, grinding up the cannabis here, and they have the strainer there, and he's about to drink the cannabis, and the serpent's going to test it out for him. This is a statue I have at home. It's made of white marble, and it's got Shiva preparing a bong, grinding it, drinking it, and smoking a chillum, and all the preparations for it all right there. And here's a marble statue of a sadhu smoking a chillum, as they do in honor of Shiva still.
And what's the trident?
The trident, this got a bunch of different meanings. I'd have to, go back and look myself. But it's not just a religious tool. They'll actually use that in battle. These guys still are you don't want to mess with them. They're more like, witch doctor, shaman than, what we would think of as like passive holy men. Many of the Shaivite sadhus are not to be messed with. And they can be full of wisdom, but they can also be some of them will go to the graveyards and eat human flesh, certain sadhus of certain sects and stuff that worship Shiva. And they cover themselves in the ash of the funeral pyre. And it's like all about facing death with life, and just accepting the reality of the material world as well as the world after. Just overcoming your fear of it and stuff. Here's Shiva smoking some chillum up there. So smoking cannabis actually became later. Initially it would have been drunk mostly in India. It's thought that smoking in general from pipes and cigarettes and bongs didn't take place until the discovery of tobacco smoking in the New World. And the majority of people either drank it or burnt it as an incense in the rest of the ancient Old World. And but it was soon grasped in India and elsewhere, and that became the more common way to partake of it. This is an 18th century of sadhus smoking the chillums and stuff. Cannabis has also been used in the cult of Kali and tantric rites. In the Festival of Colors, a yearly festival having to do with the harvest. Everybody, the whole families and the whole town gets drunk on bong, and then they throw different colored paints and dyes on themselves. A long-going festival, as well as the big Jagannath Festival. This is this huge festival where they would drag these huge chariots, and the priest and priestess partake of cannabis in order to help bring on the monsoons. And these are Nihang Sikhs. Cannabis is also used in the Sikh religion, particularly by the Nihang Sikhs. And they used to be the guardian of the ancient Sikh temples. And they're like real rebels as well, kind of like the Sadhus. It was really hard for the British Raj to bring these guys under control. They just ride around armed to the teeth on horseback, and they didn't take crap from nobody. And they prepare cannabis with these huge mortars and pestles. So this is one of the pestles. It's actually grinding cannabis there for making this a drink that they call sukadun, which is basically identical with bong, but is a pivotal part of their religious rites. Here's another guy preparing sukadun. And now we're into Assyria and Babylon, and this is a ancient inscription of the Assyrian king Esarhaddon, and he's got the royal version of the Scythian incense tent there, and he's about to go stick his head in and nail some incense there. Behind him's a symbol for the tree of life, and this is Ashurbanipal. And I bring up the Assyrian use here because in regards to spiritual use, from old inscriptions in the temple documents of the 3rd dynasty of Ur from Umma, an inscription inscribed wrote that we need a memoranda of 3 regular offerings of hemp. So it was a part of the regular inventory for the whole ritual thing, right? In the temples and stuff like that. Oh, you got to have our cannabis to hold our rituals. And in a letter written in 680 BC to the mother of the Assyrian king, Esarhaddon, who I was showing just before there, reference is made to Kanabu, which is identified as the Assyrian name for cannabis, asking what is needed for the sacred rites. And the high priest responded, the main items for the rites are fine oil, water, honey, odorous plants, and cannabis. And so this was the common way of worshiping in Assyria, Babylon, Samaria, throughout this whole region. And a large part of that is part of because of what was happening in the ancient temples, you know. Without cannabis and probably other entheogens, the gods didn't speak. And these temples were all about set and setting, and there'd be people kind of dressed up in costumes, much like Native Americans wear, with the native headdress looking like an eagle and wings, and there'd be beating of drums, and repetitive music, and smoke burning, and statues that would be illuminated by the firelight and stuff like that, moving, and the psychoactive substances like cannabis and opium and other plants, even more powerful ones like datura, would help to kind of create a kind of hypnotic vibe for the whole people participating in the ritual. And then the repetitive music, and music has always been a part of shamanism, would help to throw people into kind of a right brain trance, and kind of like a modern hip-hop artist, when they start hearing the beat and then throwing out the rhymes, that's how much of the religious text was derived in the ancient world. Most of it's written in poetry and has beat to it and rhymes and stuff like that, and that was the common means of a lot of ancient religions. And so it was all just spouted off in these inspirational moments and these magical moments in these temples produced by music and psychoactive substances. And we know about these things largely due to the Polish anthropologist Sula Bennett, who began writing about this in 1936. And she's also known as Sarah Bennett Tao. She changed her name later. And she wrote about this for about 40 years. It was a long-standing theory of hers that there was this Hebrew term, cannabosum, that was mistranslated when the Hebrew texts were translated into the Greek as calamus. And calamus is a common marsh root found throughout the Mideast, the aromatic marsh root. But she said what had happened is it had been mistranslated because a lot of the translators weren't botanists. They're just going through long volumes, translating them into Greek as they were doing with all the texts of the ancient world at the time. And so I need to give kudos to Sula Bennett for really opening up this line of research. And the Hebrews were also in contact with the Scythians, and this is where the name canna and cannabosum comes from. Once again, it's that common an in the words for cannabis, chandrahan. It's the adoption of an Indo-European root into the Hebrew language because cannabis came as an item of trade. In fact, in Ezekiel reference to canna, it says Danaanites and Greeks from Uzal brought your merchandise. They exchanged wrought iron, cassia, and canna for your wares. So it's coming in on a trade route, and it's coming with the name that it came with, and is adopted into the Hebrew land. And the later prophet Jeremiah referred to canna from a distant land. And this has been accepted by a number of other researchers, people like Professor Carl Rock and Dr. Ethan Russo, and Rabbi Ari Kaplan, a very popular a rabbi, who noted in his The Living Torah, which is a standard book for the study of the Torah, that among the many suggestions for the meaning of this word, cannabosum, and he wrote that on the basis of cognate pronunciation and a Septuagint reading, some identify cannabosum with the English and Greek cannabis, the hemp plant. So he's saying based on the sound of the word, but we know that it's much more than that, because in nearby Assyria, where it had the similar name Kanabu, it was used in identical ways to the ways in which the Hebrew were showing. And as Paul Johnson noted in A History of the Jews, prophets practiced ecstasy states and may have used incense and narcotics to produce impressive effects. The Israelite prophets acted as mediums in a state of trance or frenzy. They related their divine visions in a sing-song chant, at times a scream. These states could be induced by music, but the prophets also used and sometimes abused incenses, narcotics, and alcohol. Now, so that's not a standard book about the Old Testament and the history of the Jews. So the view is pretty widespread that they were using the same techniques of shamanic ecstasy that we find in Assyria and Babylonia. And so Moses, who first meets the angel of the Lord and flames of fire from within a burning bush, he was commanded to make a holy anointing oil, which contained cannabis. And in Exodus 30:23 we read, "Take the following fine spices, 500 shekels of liquid myrrh, half as much fragrant cinnamon, 250 shekels of cannabosum, 500 shekels of cassia, all according to the sanctuary shekel, and a hind of olive oil. Make these into a sacred anointing oil." So about 6 to 9 pounds of cannabis were mixed with myrrh and cinnamon and cassia into about 1.5 gallons of olive oil. And this was the sacred holy anointing oil. Only the priests and then later times kings could use this oil. Anybody that touched it would be cut off from the people. So it was a very elitist thing. And it was used to anoint the altar of incense. This is like dabs. Probably about 2900 BC. 800 BC. When he's putting the holy anointing oil on the altar of incense. And this was used in a place called the tent of the meeting. And so this oil, with large parts of it, would be put on the body, but it would also be placed on the altar of incense. And but it was also placed on the body. It's important to remember that cannabis, as we're finding out, can go through the skin barrier. And Dr. Ethan Russo has suggested that the addition of things like cassia and cinnamon cause more flow of blood to the skin, and thereby opening up the pores and making this substance more ingested. But we know in Assyria that they use this same method, because there's an ancient Assyrian tablet in the Louvre that reads, "So that God of man and man should be in good rapport with hellebore, cannabis, and lupine, you will rub him." And so that God and man might have good conversation, we're going to rub him with this cannabis ointment. Same sort of thing. And there he is in the tent of the meeting. And this is where they spoke to the Lord, in this small enclosed-like chamber, the tent of the meeting, which, much like the Scythian tent, was designed to hold in the smoke of the incense. And the angel of the Lord actually appeared to Moses, according to Exodus story, in the pillar of smoke over the incense altar. The pillar of smoke is actually referred to as the Shekinah, and it represents a physical presence of God in the temple. God's not speaking to Moses in the temple unless that smoke's coming up outside of the tent and pouring out, and that pillar of smoke's there. And that's so there he is again, talking to the angel of the Lord in the pillar of smoke. And the next reference occurs in the Song of Songs. And the verse is, "Your plants are an orchard of pomegranates, with choice fruits, henna and nard and saffron, canna and cinnamon, with every kind of incense tree." Now, the Song of Songs represents what was known in the ancient world as sacred marriage, the hieros gamos in the Hebrew religion. And it's important to remember that even in the Old Testament itself, through a large portion of the Age of Kings and in the books of Chronicles, that the Jewish religion itself was polytheistic. A large part of the story is about them trying to make it monotheistic. You know, they're calling it a reform, but archaeological evidence indicates that it was actually polytheistic throughout most of the whole period, and that this idea of monotheism was relatively new. And that sacred marriage would take place between deities like Dumuzi and Ishtar, but in the Hebrew region, the discovery of ancient tablets shows that Yahweh's wife, that's Jehovah, was this goddess Asherah, and there's been tablets discovered, pointing to this marriage between Yahweh and Asherah, and they sat at the pantheon of a variety of gods. And the worship of deities in that time was almost like different political factions, and monotheism was kind of almost as much a political movement to kind of monopolize the people's attention to one sole God and one sole point of view. And that had a large part to do with the disappearance of it. So this is the goddess Asherah. And here she's feeding some plant-like substance to goats. And Asherah developed out of earlier goddesses that were worshipped throughout the ancient world. It's thought that a lot of the ancient goddesses, Ishtar, Asherah, Aphrodite, all developed from an even earlier common goddess that was worshipped as the great mother of the ancient world. And this is a goddess that goes way back in that cosmology, Ishra. And cannabis was particularly sacred to her cult. It's not clear what plant was being offered in this description, because it's just a cuneiform depiction. But it may well be cannabis, because cannabis, we know, was sacred to her cult. And she also deeply influenced the worship of Ishtar, and cannabis was used in the cult of Ishtar and was called the sacred aromatic of Asherah, because it went back to her earlier use. Next we're at Isaiah, and there's a reference to cannabis in Isaiah, and that is, "You have not brought any canna for me, or lavished on me the fat of your sacrifices, but you have burdened me with your sins and wearied me with your offenses." So God's pissed off because he hasn't got any canna at the temple. And he's like, where's my cannabis? What's going on here? And a large part of that reason is because that all the temples wanted cannabis, because without the cannabis and the other entheogens, the gods did not speak. You know what I mean? It was like shamanism. And that's the real thing that is so controversial about this information. When you put cannabis in that tent with Moses in that holy smoky chamber, is Moses talking to some sort of sky god that is telling him, to go into Canaan and slaughter all those people, and here's the new set of rules? Or is Moses like a shaman, like we find in South America and Africa today, who ingest psychoactive plants and interpret that, for better or for worse, as an actual communication with the deity? You know what I mean? And that's important to understand in understanding religion, because even in the Bible, if you take a look at the different prophets and different people mention it, God spoke to them all differently, because in a lot of ways there's a certain carryover of the person's personality that God is speaking to. But lucky for Isaiah, that was not always the case, because in this next verse in Isaiah, it seems to me that God got some of his own. And this is from Isaiah. "And the posts of the door moved at the voice of him that cried, and the house was filled with smoke. Then said I, Woe is me, for I am undone, because I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips, for mine eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Then flew one of the seraphims unto me, having a live coal in his hand, which he had taken with the tongs from off the altar. And he laid it upon my mouth, and said, Lo, this has touched thy lips, and thine sin is purged, and thine iniquity is taken away." And so here is the seraphim flying with tongs from off the altar. He's got a burning coal of incense. He's holding it up for the big super hit, kind of like hot knives. Hot knives, 2,600 piece, 2,600 years ago. And the seraphim's much like the winged shaman depicted in Assyrian images and stuff like that. Again, probably has to do with the ritual dress and And here is Isaiah again getting a super hit from the seraphim. And here's an example of an Assyrian deity, and he's got some sort of pine cone-like thing there he's been collecting from the sacred tree of life. And here's a picture of a Native American shaman or dancer. And so the next one, this is where we start to see the disfavor coming into cannabis in the Old Testament. And what is happening at this time is Assyria and other nations are attacking the Israelites, and they're starting to lose control of their kingdom. And they, the monotheistic prophets of Yahweh are saying this is all due to them worshiping other deities. It's because, oh, you're worshiping these other gods, God's going to punish you. So he's going to send in all these polytheistic cultures that worship all sorts of other gods to conquer you, basically, which doesn't make a lot of sense. And so we have a reference to Cana in the story of Jeremiah, and that one is clearly in disfavor. What do I care about your incense from Sheba, or your Cana from a distant land? Your burnt offerings are not acceptable. Your sacrifices do not please me. So there's a clear rejection of the earlier use of cannabis. And this has, for one thing, they're looking for, under monotheism, was about rules and regulations and how we live as a society and what we have to do to maintain that society. So there wasn't a lot of room for prophets coming out of smoky chambers with new revelations from God. And also it had to do with the influence of the goddess worship. It was very popular amongst the ancient people. And we know this is the case in the story of Jeremiah because of the next verse, which is quite long, so bear with me. Thus saith Jeremiah has gone into Egypt where a lot of Israelites were living, and he's saying, okay, because of you, it's all fallen apart in Israel because you're continuing to worship other gods and you're not just worshiping Yahweh alone. And he gives them this lecture. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, ye have seen all the evil that I have brought upon Jerusalem, upon the cities of Judah, and behold, this day they are in desolation, because of their wickedness which they have committed to provoke me to anger, in that they wanted to burn incense and to serve other gods. Therefore now, wherefore commit ye this great evil against your souls, in that ye provoke me to wrath with the works of your hands, burning incense unto other gods in the land of Egypt? Then all the men that knew that their wives had burned incense unto other gods, and all the women that stood by, a great multitude, even all the people that dwelt in the land of Egypt, answered Jeremiah, saying, As for the word which thou hast spoken unto us in the name of the Lord, we will not hearken unto thee, but we will certainly do whatever thing goeth forth out of our own mouth, to burn incense unto the Queen of heaven, and to pour drink offerings unto her, as we have done, we and our fathers, our kings and our princes in the city of Judah and in the streets of Jerusalem. For them we had plenty of victuals, and were well, and saw no evil. And so they're saying under this polytheistic time, when both the goddess and the god were worshipped alongside, things were really great. And that was the peak of their kingdom and the peak of their wealth. And now this monotheism's come along. That's when it all started falling apart. And when you think about the imbalance that monotheism has caused in our culture with women, it's nice that there's so many women in this course, because it's women that have really suffered tremendously due to this idea of male monotheism. And the goddess worship, which goddesses like Asherah and Asherah developed out of, they come from a much more ancient line of worship. There was a whole period of history prior to this rise of monotheism and prior to the rise of even polytheism that are known as the Age of the Great Mother. And Sula Bennett believed this is when the mass use of hashish for ceremonial purposes really began, was in the Age of the Great Mother. And so that's the story of the Cana references. But now we come to these new references, which I wrote about in the Soma book. And this has to do with Ezra and the cup of fire. And Ezra is the editor of the Old Testament. There's a variety of, the Old Testament's a hodgepodge of ancient Near Eastern documents put together in one book. And they're written at different times by different editors and different groups with different beliefs. And the guy that put them in together and edited them to have some sort of coherence together is this, or credited with it historically anyways, is this guy Ezra. And he was living in Persia under the Persians. The Persians, the Israelites fell under the Assyrians, Babylonians, and then a variety of other cultures, and then the Persians beat out those guys, and the Persians sent them home, back to the region, is what the story is. And Ezra was one of these guys sent back into the region to bring back Judea monotheism, because apparently it had gone back into polytheism and they were worshipping all sorts of gods and goddesses again. And so here is Ezra's own account of the making of Jewish history. The next day, behold, a voice cried to me, saying, Ezra, open thy mouth and drink from this full cup, which as it were as water, but the color of it is like fire. And he says that after he drank from the cup, that God commanded him to drink from the cup, and then he was shown like some of my text here is kind of missing. That was what gave him the voice. That was what guided him to put the Old Testament together as it sits right now, is apparently after drinking from this cup of fire. And so here he is drinking it. Now, interestingly, a variety of researchers like George Brown, writing in over a century and a half ago, believe that this cup was actually a preparation of Haoma that was brought by the Persians, which had sent him back to his homeland. And wrote about this, and said that Haoma itself was a preparation of him, and that this was what Ezra was drinking for his thing. And more than a century later, just in our own time, Vicente Dubraca independently has been saying that what Ezra was drinking was a cannabis-infused wine, much like Zoroaster was giving out to his disciples, and that this is what inspired Ezra. So this was, and that the monotheism itself came from Persia. Zoroaster was the monotheistic reformer that reformed the Mazdaran religion, where Haoma was used, and turned it into the monotheism that is a modern Zoroastrian religion, which still exists. And that because the Jews were the vassals of the Persian state, that they thought it was easier to control those people by having them under one god, so they only had to deal with one kind of priesthood and leadership. And so they started spreading monotheism to these different polytheistic communities. And we know that cannabis was used in the region through this discovery of this fossilized cannabis thing that was also found with a bottle with vials with oil of cannabis and other things in it, that was discovered in the tomb of a woman that had died during childbirth, and they'd been using cannabis medically, topically, and also burning it. And this is a carbonized cannabis residue that was found at that site.
Back to who we are, I don't see how you don't see.
You're Lazarus. You're the dry bones. You're the prodigal son. You're the lost sheep. You're the people about whom the Bible is speaking, who will stand up in the last days when the trumpet is sounded.
I shall keep it until the end. Give me understanding, and I shall keep your law. Yea, I shall observe it with my whole heart. Hallelujah. Hallelujah.